The 25th year of Everett football under coaches DiBiase and Milo kicked off against longtime rivals Everett. After coming off Coach Dibb's worst season at 5-5, the Tide looked to bounce back and capture its 11th Super Bowl title. The Crimson Tide got on the board first as senior quarterback Jordan McAfee finds junior Anthony Norcia wide open down the sideline.
Number 11, Anthony Norcia, to the 10, to the 5, touchdown, Crimson Tide, and I don't see any laundry on the field.
The first quarter was all Everett as the defense held the Hawks to minimal yards and no points. But early in the second, Xaverian found the end zone, beating the defense to the outside, tying the game at 7. With momentum starting to swing in the Hawks' favor, their defensive line capitalized on a blown play in the backfield, resulting in a huge loss, forcing the Tide to punt. What happened next is exactly what Crimson Tide fans feared. A deep pass from quarterback Madison Cronin down the sideline set up the Hawks deep in Everett territory. The Tide defense was showing signs of bending, not breaking, after a violent hit brought some much-needed momentum, albeit short-lived. Shortly before the half, the Tide looked to have the answer, but the refs thought otherwise.
This is Jordan McAfee, and what a run from Jordan McAfee!
We got a penalty behind the play. Are you kidding me?
Whatever Coach Dibb said at halftime really fired up the defense. While the defense continued its dominant effort, Xaverian won the battle of field position, forcing the offense to work out of the shadows of their own end zone, increasing the margin for error.
And that ball was fumbled, and that time Xaverian did recover, and that's just, come on, are you kidding me?
The defense held its ground, holding Xaverian to only 3 points. Just when you thought Xaverian was in total control, Jason Maitre had ideas of his own. The defense continued to stand tall, giving the offense one last chance to win the game.
Here we go, here's McAfee, back to pass. McAfee going downfield, he's got a guy. This is Anthony Norcia. Anthony Norcia makes a move. He's going downfield. Norcia. Anthony Norcia with the huge play. I don't see any flags on the field.
After 2 straight incompletions and an offside penalty, the Tide faced a make or break 3rd and 15.
And that's picked off. That ball's picked off by number 43.
In week 2, the Crimson Tide returned home to face New Bedford. The defense continued to flex its muscle, wreaking havoc in the Whalers' backfield all night long. With a great week of practice, the offense rediscovered its chemistry. The Tide went on their way to post 51 points. With homecoming next week, this was the confidence they needed to get ready for their big test against St. John's Prep. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon at Everett Veterans Memorial Stadium for the Crimson Tide's annual homecoming game against St. John's Prep. The Tide enjoyed another quick start offensively before fizzling out in the Eagles' territory.
Block is out in front. Nice little cut by Fedner. He's got a first down to the 41-yard line.
But the defense bailed out the offense as it left Prep's first-year quarterback Mike Yaron with no time to throw.
He's going to get caught and buried. He's lucky to get the ball away.
A couple drives later, the first points were scored. Sophomore Mikey Sainristil was shot out of a cannon for a 95-yard punt return.
Down the sideline, needs one block. He's gone.
The defense never took their foot off the gas, as the Preps offense was left searching for positive yards. After an Anthony Norsha touchdown, the Tide offense continued to rise as Mikey Samersville showcased his skill set, leaving St. John's Prep with little hope of a comeback in the second half. In the second half, it was more of the same. The Tide defense continued its perfect game, forcing a fumble, setting the stage for senior running back Chris Jenkins.
They turn the corner, breaking it, and he's gone. Jenkins, 83 yards.
A homecoming victory never tasted so sweet. After coming off a huge homecoming win last week, the Crimson Tide enter the halfway point of the season, facing the Billerica Indians for the first time since 2009. Everett wasted little time disrupting the home field advantage as Marvin Svedna punched in the first score of the game.
Gets loose, gone for a touchdown off the right side.
The Indians, however, showed composure, returning the ensuing kickoff into Everett territory to begin their first drive of the game.
Getting loose, breaking a couple of tackles, staying on his feet. A great return.
After the defense forced a 3-and-out on the short field, Marvin Svedna got the offense back in action with another explosive run, setting up Anthony Norsha for a 14-0 Crimson Tide lead. On the other side of the ball, the defense continued to live up to the early season hype, making it next to impossible for the Indians to find any offensive rhythm.
Yeah, he's going to get buried for a loss.
Back and forth possessions went by the board until the high-powered Indians offense found life. After capitalizing on its rollout passing attack, they punched it in right before the half. The Tide made things interesting on the final drive of the second quarter until the Billerica secondary came alive, keeping it a 7-point game and, more importantly, receiving the ball to start the second half. Before you knew it, this game was tied. A couple plays later, this happened.
Wide open down the middle, and he's going to go in for the touchdown. Wow, wide open down the middle.
With momentum firmly on the Indian side, the Tide had a hard time doing anything right.
The pitch, and slipping and falling.
Like a shark in the water, Billerica smelled blood and completed something no one saw coming.
They got him there. What a great ball.
Excellent call, excellent execution.
Moments later, the board was flipped.
Receiver
Rolling.
slipped.
Caught for the touchdown.
Wow, the receiver slipped.
Like a heavyweight fight, the Tide did not blink. Jordan McAfee finds Anthony Norsha on consecutive plays, cutting into the Indians' territory, eventually setting up the game-tying touchdown. With the game tied and the defense handing the keys to the offense, the Tide looked like they would win this in regulation, but the Indians thought otherwise, sending this one to overtime. After the Tide were unable to convert any points first, the stage was set for Billerica.
It's good. And Billerica will celebrate.
After the devastating loss to Billerica, the Tide went into the final stretch of the regular season. Demolishing the last 3 teams, Everett went on to win the Greater Boston League title for the final time. The first round of the playoffs kicked off at Trinity Stadium in Haverhill as the number 5 seed Crimson Tide faced off against the 4 seed Hillies of Haverhill. After a huge return to start the game, the Tide rushed into Hilly territory, getting on the board first.
They run it again off the right side. He walks in for a touchdown.
And just like that, the Tide continued to roll.
And look at him. Just,
Wow.
That's called the...
He caught it off the kid's helmet.
The offense weren't the only one shining, as the special teams came to life, pinning Haverhill down on their own one. The Hillies offense had no room to breathe, as the Tide defense stuffed them, making it impossible for any positive yards. The Haverhill offense finally capitalized, entering into Everett territory. But right before halftime, as the Hillies thought to see the light at the end of the tunnel, the Tide defense emerged. The Haverhill coach seemed to have said the right things to his team during halftime as they opened the second half marching down the field. But the last glimmer of light was closed for good when Mikey Sainristil returned an interception to the house.
Cutting back inside, he gets a block, score! Mike Sainristil, 87 yards.
In the Division I North semifinals, Coach DiBiaso and his Crimson Tide would take on the Central Catholic Raiders, looking to avenge last year's loss in the North Final. Right off the bat, the Tide were off and running as Jacob Miller took a handoff to the outside into Central territory.
They're going to the air. First pass of the game. He's got Makery wide open.
As if the Tide hadn't already announced their presence, a fumble recovery on the ensuing kickoff would. With a short field to work with, the special teams unit would again capitalize, as Gabe D'Souza knocks down the field goal. Central Catholic finally had its first possession on offense and appeared destined to get some points back. But R.J. Fiali thought otherwise, and before you knew it, the Tide began to rise.
Touchdown, Crimson Tide!
With all the makings of a blowout in place, the Raiders answered and got themselves on the board, then a little trickery on the onside kick. After the Tide D shut Central down, Coach Dib decided it was time to use a trick of his own.
Wow! Jaleel Marinez on a play that you see in a video game. Are you kidding me? Wow! Anthony Norsha on a hook and ladder.
The gavel was slammed when Duval Paul forced a fumble, setting up Josh Miller with a 54-yard return down the sideline and sending Raiders fans to find the nearest exit. The Crimson Tide returned home to take on the Andover Golden Warriors in the Division I North Final. On the game's first play, Chris Jenkins took a jet sweep to the sideline, putting the Tide in business. 2 plays later, Marvin Svedna found the end zone, and Everett's string of scoring on its first drive in the playoffs remained intact. Andover converted a 3rd and 18 on its first series before losing their way to a Tide defense that was everywhere. With the offense back on the field, it was time for Mikey Sainristil to further introduce himself.
Down the sideline, Norsha with a terrific block. What a great play!
The Golden Warriors would counter on the next kickoff, returning it all the way down inside the 10, setting up their first points of the game and cutting their deficit in half. Going back to a steady diet of ground and pound, Jacob Miller led a bruising attack for the Tide's 3rd score in as many drives. With the offense scoring at will, the defense continued to elevate its play as Jason Maitrey comes down with the interception. The Tide would capitalize on the short field as Chris Jenkins punched it in from a few yards out. It became apparent that the Golden Warriors were overwhelmed by the speed and physicality of the Crimson Tide defense.
They're at him again, and they nailed him again.
You don't run away from Paul.
After Andover managed to cut their deficit, Everett decided to open their floodgates and wash away the Warriors.
93 yards, Mike Sandristil. The inside reverse to Jenkins, and he is long gone and easy to find right in the end zone.
When it was all said and done, a high tide warning was in effect, and Everett was headed back to the Super Bowl with a shot at redemption. With their sights firmly set on the Super Bowl, the Crimson Tide had one last appetizer before the main course, as they would play on Thanksgiving morning for the first time in 5 years against the Masconomet Chieftains. The Everett Crimson Tide are back in the Super Bowl after a one-year absence, taking on the two-time defending state champions, the Xaverian Hawks. On the game's first play, the Tide would set the tone.
The quick catch, he's got a step, looking for a block.
Continuing their theme of scoring on its first possession, Everett was facing a 4th and 3, and Marvin Svedna would not be denied. The very next play, the Tide would strike, as Mikey Sainristil showed off his speed. With Everett scoring on its first drive, Xaverian desperately wanted to answer with points of their own. The only problem, the Crimson Tide defense was on a mission.
Flush him out again. Taking off, he's going to get hit and knocked down. Bins!
In the biggest moments, sometimes it's the names not known that make the greatest impact. With 9:07 to play in the first half, Jordan McAfee throws a strike to David Zarilla for a 56-yard gain, setting up Marvin Svedna on the very next play to punch it in from 10 yards out and giving the Tide a commanding 14-0 lead.
They keep it alive. Looking, he's in trouble. Dumps it off, and they nail him right away.
Now it's the defense's turn to put the clamps on the methodical Hawks offense, keeping the momentum on the Crimson Tide side with halftime fast approaching. Everett's stifling defensive unit continued to keep the Hawks grounded. Mikey Sainristil provided a highlight reel catch that propelled Everett to its third touchdown of the day. With just under 4 minutes remaining, Jordan McAfee finds Theo Zador, and the route was on. The nail in the coffin came with 2:02 left in the game, as Jason Maitre is going to pick off an errant pass from Madison Cronin, sealing the victory and 11th state championship during the DiBiase era. The trophy was coming back to 100 Elm Street.